So when I give a clinic to a group of high school trumpet players, I like to ask who initially chose the trumpet because it looked like it would be a simple instrument to play. Now I always get a few hands, but when I ask if it worked out that way, nobody ever says yes. And the reason is that the mechanical simplicity of 3 valves is counterbalanced by the need for the lips to do a lot of the heavy lifting, which they aren't designed or suited for. Now, despite this, I tell trumpet students that if they're using their body properly, it can look to an observer as if all you have to do is push the valves and the notes come out. Enter the wind synthesizer, and specifically the R1 wind synthesizer from Robkoo. Now, this is the second video in which theoretically I'm reviewing the R1, but my experience is solely that of a trumpet player. Now, I've been a professional musician for decades, but I have no experience playing electronic instruments, so I agreed to do this out of curiosity and as a musical experiment. In the first video, I talked about some of my thoughts and questions before I had even turned it on. In this one, I'm sharing my experiences having played the R1 for 1 month. I've practiced every day for an average of 30 to 60 minutes, and in that time I've gone from having absolutely no idea what to do with it to the point that I can play scales and arpeggios in every key, albeit with quite a few wrong notes. Now that's actually quite a lot of progress, although it might not sound obvious unless you heard my initial efforts, and you can thank me for sparing you that misery. I've had to figure out a lot of this by myself because there are very few videos on YouTube about wind synthesizers from the perspective of a brass player. Now, hopefully this video will help rectify that dearth of information. The R1 is similar to the trumpet in certain ways, and it actually eliminates the most difficult aspects of playing the trumpet. Still, I've found it to be a frustrating process learning to play it. Now, that mostly relates to me learning something new, but there is one aspect of the instrument that feels awkward. I'll talk about that in this video, and also about operating the R1 in brass fingering mode. The specific details may be lost on a non-brass player, but hopefully there's enough generality to keep you interested. I'll start with some general information. The R1 is powered by an internal rechargeable battery, which is connected via USB-C, which also allows you to connect it to a computer. An extensive menu system can be accessed either on the instrument or via the app. Now that provides a lot of customization options, including key and breath sensitivity, volume, reverb, fingering, tuning, transposition, etc. I've pitched the instrument in B-flat to match my trumpet. There are 30 onboard sounds, and I'll talk more about them a little later. The R1 has no speaker, so you need a wired connection to headphones or external amplification, and there are 1/8 and 1/4 inch outputs for that purpose. In this video, you're hearing it come through a small monitor speaker mic'd by an Electrovoice RE20, which is the same mic that I use on my voice. It might seem surprising that an instrument which is marketed to consumers can't be heard on its own, but no speaker that small could do justice to the sound, and it would add unnecessary bulk. The design of the R1 is sleek and streamlined. It looks good and not overly intimidating for someone used to an instrument with only 3 buttons. Now, as I knew I would, I love the fact that I can play the R1 silently through headphones. For part of the month I was away on vacation, and I was able to practice in a room full of people. While I was there, I handed it to my 90-year-old mother. I described it to her as an electronic flute because that was her instrument many moons ago. She was a little hesitant, but she agreed to give it a try. And changing these fingers and those fingers will all change the notes. I don't like it. Now, my kids laughed when they saw that clip because their grandma always says what she thinks. Even if my mom doesn't seem to be a likely purchaser, that brief demonstration shows how easy it is to get sound out of it, even for someone with limited breath capacity. Playing an acoustic wind instrument like the trumpet requires a lot of air power and control. Wind synths require much less of the player in this regard. A gentle puff will produce a full-fledged sound. For me, this is both a pro and a con, because I'm aware of the health benefits that accrue from maintaining a high degree of breath control. Now, this is one but not the only area in which a wind synthesizer is unquestionably easier to play, and yet it feels like something may be lost in the process. Now still, as I acknowledged in the previous video, I realize that there may come a time for me when an easier path to musical expression makes sense. For someone without musical experience or with limited physical stamina, you can get up and running on the R1 pretty quickly. With just a bit of practice, you'll be able to play simple songs with a wide variety of sounds, and that can provide quite a bit of musical satisfaction. Although the R1 is designed for simplicity and it's priced at the lower end for wind synths, it's not a toy. From what I can gather from watching videos, Robkoo has done a very good job of incorporating a lot of advanced features at a reasonable price point. Wind synthesizers in general, and especially the higher-end models, are geared primarily towards sax players. For them, the transition is intuitive and in some cases almost seamless. Now it's quite a bit less so for a brass player, not just because of the fingering, but because there are certain things you can do on the saxophone that are easier than they are on the trumpet. I mean, just the existence of an octave key would revolutionize my existence. And as I replied to a comment on the last video, the pinky ring doesn't count. Some aspects of playing the trumpet are easily transferable, like breath control, which is quite responsive on the R1. It has a wide dynamic range, especially at the low end. You can bring it down to almost nothing. Tonguing feels pretty natural as well, although I do get the feeling that the instrument can't always keep up with me. Now, I don't know as I would ever have a need for triple tonguing on the R1, but it is possible. One of the things that convinced me to give this a try is that the R1 can be configured to use my familiar trumpet fingering. So the right hand functions almost exactly the same. But the left hand has to be utilized as well because it replaces the function of the lips in determining register. This is both a physical challenge because my left hand lacks the dexterity of the right, and a mental one because I'm combining actions that are deeply ingrained with other actions that are not. So the left hand is a stumbling block for my right. At one point I wondered whether I might be better off learning to play the R1 with sax fingering to isolate myself from the familiar action of the right hand. But that would sort of defeat the purpose of the exercise, and I feel like I should be able to progress faster with ability that I already possess rather than starting anew. Emily from Robkoo and I talked about the idea that this fingering would probably only be used by those who already play a brass instrument. The brass fingering mode is called EVI Plus because it's based on the original electronic valve instrument. It requires the primary use of 5 fingers, the normal 3 valve fingers on the right hand, plus the thumb and the forefinger on the left. The fingers contact a series of 7 touch-sensitive buttons on top of the R1. I've heard woodwind players say that they prefer physical buttons or keys so that they can keep their fingers in contact at all times. For me, I'm in the habit of lifting my fingers off the valves to make sure that they're moving as fast as possible, because the distance of travel for a valve is greater than a woodwind key. So the touch-sensitive buttons work well for me, and the definitive action of touching or not touching the buttons transfers to my valve technique on the trumpet. To explain how these work, we'll number the touch-sensitive buttons down from the mouthpiece as 1, 2, 3 on the left hand and 4, 5, 6, 7 on the right. The 3 valve fingers are on buttons 4, 5, and 6. The fingering is the same in all octaves based on the lowest octave of the trumpet. So C sharp is always fingered 1, 2, 3, D is always fingered 1 and 3, and so on. F sharp and G can be fingered 2 different ways, as they are on the very bottom of the horn or as they are an octave above. On the forefinger of the left hand, button 1 lowers the overall pitch by a fourth. Buttons 2 and 3 raise and lower the pitch 1/2 step respectively. Pressing the 2 simultaneously has no effect. Therefore, you can keep those fingers in contact. Now that gives you better dexterity with the thumb and forefinger, and it took me a while to figure that out. On the back side, the left thumb operates 4 buttons that drop the overall pitch by an octave or raise it by 1 or 2 octaves. There are other buttons and features that I haven't really made much use of yet. The right pinky button raises the overall pitch a fourth, and left pinky buttons duplicate the half-step function, and a pitch wheel is operated by the right thumb. The buttons can be reassigned, and there's also a gyroscopic feature that adds effects like vibrato when you lift the instrument up. So the challenge in making an electronic instrument that replicates the experience of playing the trumpet centers on the fact that we only use a maximum of 7 valve combinations to produce 12 notes in multiple octaves. Every valve combination can produce quite a few notes, and changing from one to the next is done primarily by the lips in coordination with the air. For example, on the trumpet, we have 7 notes over a 2-octave range from low C to high C that can be played without pushing any valves. We call these notes partials, and they're based on the overtone series. When I depress valves, air is channeled through additional tubing, effectively lengthening the instrument and lowering the pitch. There are 8 possible combinations of 3 valves, but 2 of them essentially duplicate each other, so there's effectively 7, each of which lowers the pitch by 1/2 step. We can produce the full overtone series on each of these 7 valve combinations, and when combined, they contain all the notes of a chromatic scale. On the trumpet, the valve combination and the lips determine the pitch and the register of a note. On the R1, these are entirely determined by the 3 fingers on the right hand and the thumb and the forefinger on the left. Here's how that works. From 3rd space C on the trumpet, I finger down chromatically until I reach A flat, which is fingered 2 and 3. It works exactly the same on the R1. On the trumpet, to descend from A flat to G, all I have to do is lift the 2nd and 3rd valves, and the instrument naturally drops to the next open partial. On the R1, if I simply release the 2nd and 3rd fingers of the right hand, the instrument jumps back up to C. In order to get the instrument to descend to G, I have to simultaneously press button 1 with my left hand. Button 1 lowers the pitch of the instrument a fourth, so open C becomes open G. From G, I descend chromatically to D flat using the normal valve combinations on the right hand. On the R1, it works exactly the same, but I have to keep my left forefinger down to keep me in the correct range. Descending from D flat to low C on the trumpet is once again simply a matter of lifting my right fingers, and the horn drops again to the next open partial. On the R1, if I just lift my fingers, like before, the pitch will jump back up to G. To get it to descend from D flat to C requires 3 separate finger actions. The 3 right fingers and the left forefinger lift to get me back to open fingering for C. But to choose low C rather than 3rd space C, my left thumb has to simultaneously slide down and press the next octave button. Now, if this sounds tricky, you'll get no argument from me. I find it awkward to move my thumb smoothly and accurately from one button to the next, doubly so because the movement is somewhat diagonal as well as up and down. I'm forever hitting the wrong button, which injects displaced octaves into the line. Now, the thumb buttons are the one aspect of the R1 that I really don't like, but I know other major manufacturers use a similar setup, so hopefully it's just a matter of refining my technique. Anyway, to play a chromatic scale, I have to be very careful when I cross the breakpoints, one between G and A flat, and especially the one between C and D flat, since that's where the thumb has to move. Now, there are a few workarounds. If all you have to do is maneuver a half step past the break, you can use buttons 2 and 3 to raise or lower the pitch to avoid having to move the thumb. For example, I can play a D-flat scale and push the C at the top up a half step rather than moving my thumb to play D-flat in the upper octave. Likewise, if I'm descending, I can push the D-flat down a half step to C. On the trumpet, our lips can feel where we are in the range, and that tactile sensation is connected to the tactile sensation in our fingers. C sharp in the middle of the staff, which is fingered 1 and 2, feels quite different at the embouchure than low C sharp, which is fingered 1, 2, and 3. On the R1, the pitch is solely determined by pushing the right button, somewhat like the piano. Now, is it easier to push buttons rather than manipulating the embouchure as well? Unquestionably so, but when you've spent half a century playing the trumpet, it's a challenging transition. Of course, one of the main attractions of a wind synthesizer is the ability to produce a wide range of sounds. The R1 has 30 high-quality onboard sounds. Now, that's a small number compared to some of the more expensive wind synths, but this is not really designed for the professional wind synth player. At this point, there's no way to add or substitute sounds, but Robkoo has plans to add that feature in the future. Of course, as a MIDI controller, the R1 has the potential to be used with any external sound bank. About a third of the sounds are traditional Chinese instruments, and the high quality of these patches has been a selling point in Robkoo's home market. Now, having no knowledge of Chinese music, I don't know how to do the musical justice, especially since I'm just barely at the point of playing scales, but they do sound pretty cool. Most of the rest of the sounds are emulations of Western instruments, brass, woodwind, and strings. Now, I've never heard a trumpet sample that could fool me for a minute into thinking that it was the real thing, and this one is no different. Now, that's not a criticism of the R1 per se. I just think that the trumpet is a hard instrument to emulate. Now, I will say that the double C is a heck of a lot easier on the R1. The stringed instruments sound more authentic to my ears, although string players might have a similar reaction to mine regarding the trumpet sound. Among the woodwinds, the flute and the recorder sound more realistic than the reed instruments to my ears. So mostly up to now, I've just been practicing scales and arpeggios. I've also been playing simple melodies in various keys. This is actually good mental practice in transposition, and it reveals troublesome intervallic finger combinations. For example, the final phrase of "It Could Happen to You" begins with a flat 7 interval that I consistently misfinger when it takes me across the break. The tune "Somewhere" begins with the same interval. Now I'll note here that a flat 7 is a fairly wide interval on the trumpet, and it requires deft manipulation of the embouchure. In the R1, if you can push the right buttons, you can play any interval with ease. In an attempt to place the R1 in some sort of musical context, despite my limited ability, I'll use the tune "My Romance" to demonstrate the range of some of the sounds. Okay, so where does this leave me after 1 month? On the one hand, if you were learning to play the trumpet in that amount of time, you'd barely be able to get out a few notes. So by that measure, my progress has been rapid, and I'm encouraged by how much I've learned. Also knowing that just the process of mental and physical challenge is a good thing in and of itself. At the same time, I'm impatient for the day when the finger action becomes intuitive so that I can focus more on the music than pushing the right buttons. After a session on the R1, it's a relief to turn back to my rightful horn, although every trumpet player knows that that instrument comes with its own set of challenges which never go away no matter how long you play it. So I'm looking forward to seeing how much more progress is made in the next month or two, and I'll report back with another video. In the meantime, there's a ton of content on this channel relating to music and more coming all the time. So please take a second to click the like button and leave a comment so that I know you're out there. If you want to keep up with the videos that I post, I'm sure you know how to do that.